Welcome everybody to another in our series of conversations between Brar and Caleb Maupin. I'm Jyoti Brar, and today we're going to be talking about NATO's war to destroy Yugoslavia in 1999. But before we do get into the events of 1999, I think we need to talk about what it was that made the imperialists so desperate to target Yugoslavia as soon as the Soviet Union fell. War in Yugoslavia really began right at the beginning of the 1990s. So the crowning event in that process was NATO's war against Yugoslavia in 1999, which of course was 25 years ago this year. But I wondered, Harpal, if you could start off by explaining the motivation behind the project to destroy Yugoslavia.
Well, I mean, in sum total, the project was exactly the same as the first Gulf War. And it's basically world domination. Imperialism felt emboldened. As Stalin had said a long while ago, if the Soviet Union should fall, God forbid, the proletariat of the world will be seized by the throat, and all the gains that we have made would be lost. So once the Soviet Union fell, imperialism felt emboldened. It had no fear of anybody because the Yeltsin regime in Russia, in newly capitalistic Russia, was entirely dependent on US support in every possible way, and therefore went along with everything that was required. And nobody else was in a position to have a counterweight against the US. So really, just as the Soviet Union was collapsing, there was the first Gulf War. The Yugoslav War was the first war waged by imperialism, which would become a template for several wars afterwards. Then there would be the Afghan War, there would be the Iraq War, there is the Syrian War, there is the Libyan War, everything that you can think of. And that is what imperialism has been doing. And of course, avenue pretexts were formed as to why the war should be waged against Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia occupied a very important position. It's at the hub of transport routes for oil and gas between Central Asia and connecting the whole region from the Middle East to the Black and the Caspian Seas. Secondly, there is a long history of Yugoslavia being under the influence of Russia, be it the Tsarist times, and be it at least up to 1948, the Soviet times. So the US imperialists wanted to make sure Yugoslavia would be on their side and they could use it for their own purposes. That was the basic reason behind the Yugoslav war.
It's very interesting, isn't it? There was a process during the 1990s of re-Balkanizing Yugoslavia, breaking it up into its 6 constituent parts, which had been joined together by socialist Yugoslavia after World War II. And, the fact is, we already had this word, this adjective, balkanizing, because of how that region was fragmented during the imperialist era leading up to World War I. This process of we actually describe the process of breaking a country into pieces as balkanization, and that predates the 1990s balkanizing process that happened to Yugoslavia. But quite clearly, we see that template, as Dad said, of if you want to control an area, the best thing you can do is divide it into small pieces and get them to fight one another. And you saw this with the most tragic consequences in Yugoslavia all through the 1990s. Yugoslavia was at war, a series of wars to break away bits of Yugoslavia. And ever since then, the last remaining part that wanted to stay true to Yugoslavia as a whole project and the more Russia-aligned, Soviet-aligned kind of ideology, which was the Serbian part. The Serbs are the ones who've been absolutely demonized and history rewritten to ascribe all of the imperialist crimes to the Serbs because of the fact that they were the ones who were the most staunch defenders of Yugoslavia. Before we come on to 1999, Caleb, I wondered if you wanted to add anything to that.
Well, I think it's important to note that the 1948 division between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, that was certainly a kind of an important moment to note, because that was the imperialists, it was the first step in dividing socialist countries. Prior to that, the communist countries of the world had been completely united. And that you'll notice that the fact that Yugoslavia turned against the Soviet Union didn't get them off the hook. It didn't make the imperialists not want to overthrow them, right? And just the same, 1989, China was pretty well aligned with the United States around the world, but that didn't prevent the attempted color revolution of Tiananmen, right? At the same time, the color revolutions were happening across Eastern Europe. And that needs to be pointed out. And that there were, huge achievements in economic development carried out by the Yugoslav government. And I think that we should acknowledge that as well. And that they did have more of a market socialist model. And they presented their model as being more revolutionary than the Soviet Union, but it wasn't. It was actually decentralization. The worker self-management was kind of a weird, Trotskyite kind of thing that they implemented, and it kind of weakened socialism in some ways, but they presented it as being ultra revolutionary. But even though they made huge concessions to the imperialists, they still, that still didn't stop the imperialists from trying to overthrow them and ultimately succeeding. We
could do a whole other show about the Tito White project. I was just thinking of some other things there, but I won't go into it.
Following Voltaire, I would take his sane advice. Now is not the time to make new enemies.
Yes, we won't go into I won't go into Tito.
I'm not starry-eyed about Yugoslavia under Tito. And the progress that Yugoslavia made was very much the case that it broke away with the Soviet Union, and it therefore got lots and lots of financial help and other help from the United States and other imperialist countries, which allowed Yugoslavia to provide a standard of living, which otherwise, under the economic system they had adopted, as Caleb has rightly said, they could not afford anyway. But the moment the Eastern European countries collapsed, there was no need for Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia was under debt to the imperialist countries to the tune of 20 billion, and they wanted their payments back. And the Yugoslav standard of living collapsed by 40% within a short period of time. And of course, within the Yugoslav Federation, some countries were richer than others. Croatia and Slovenia were. So German imperialism, I really call them Nazis. They never stopped being Nazis. They were beaten in the Second World War, but their ideology has been very much guided by Nazism. And a lot of defeated Nazis, high officials, were in the government of West Germany. Those who did not go to the United States actually stayed in Germany. So Yugoslavia. So the Germans recognized the independence of Croatia, the independence of Slovenia, and they set the ball rolling. And of course, the Yugoslavs then tried to prevent that. They did not succeed because Croatia and Slovenia had the support of US imperialism. And the Croatians actually indulged in massive ethnic cleansing. They got rid of nearly 300,000 Serbs from theirs to create a really ethnically cleansed Croatia. So that's the history of that. We can come to that another time. As far as the Yugoslav war is concerned, it's the first war after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which became a template for subsequent imperialist wars, which we're still facing, the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine. If I can give you just a few facts, both of you are very knowledgeable, but some of our audiences may not know it. This year, as Jyoti rightly said, is the 25th anniversary of the Yugoslav war. On the 24th of March 1999, NATO began its brutal war against Yugoslavia. It lasted 78 days. NATO had gone thinking it would be a war that lasts 2 or 3 days. But the Yugoslavs put up fierce resistance. 1,000 NATO warplanes and cruise missiles hit targets in Yugoslavia. 19 NATO countries with a combined population of 600 million people, possessed of enormous amounts of wealth and sophisticated weaponry, were fighting against a tiny country whose population is that of the size of Greater London. NATO's GDP was 1,163 times greater than that of Yugoslavia. Its population was 77 times, its territory 226 times. NATO flew 35,776 sorties and it carried out 12,000 strikes. 1,000 fighter planes took part. 35,000 cluster bombs were dropped on Yugoslavia. So that was the brutality of NATO's war. And they're the ones who will tell you how brutal Russia's war against Ukraine is, and just shows you with what restraint the Russian Federation has acted in its anti-NATO war.
You know, this war against Yugoslavia that was launched in 1999, it was the first of a string, as Rapal said, of wars that were launched by British Prime Minister Tony Blair, the Labour Prime Minister. In this particular case, it was alongside the US Democrat President Bill Clinton. Later on, he was to launch wars with Republican President George Bush. But, you know, the reasons they gave to the public for mobilizing NATO were new ones. They came up with this concept of the right to protect, to evade international law, to say, we have to intervene before something happens, just in case, because we think something is about to happen, right? And they cited the fact that a genocide was going to happen, about to be underway in Kosovo, and they set up this force, local proxy force called the Kosovo Liberation Army. I don't know if either of you have anything to say about the right to protect or the Kosovo Liberation Army before we talk about the actual waging of the war.
I'll just share that one story that I heard, Cleveland, Ohio, where I used to do a lot of political work, has a lot of Eastern European folks in it. And one story I heard from my comrades was that they were having a conversation about, the need for a national healthcare service. And they were at a hardware store. And they were just talking about how, we could have, healthcare could be provided. It would be better. They have this in Britain, et cetera. And the owner of the store, the guy behind the clerk, overheard this and shouted, "That's a bunch of Serbian propaganda." Because the Serbs were identified with socialism and with communism. And he was like Croatian or Slovenian or something like that. And that he heard it and he didn't say that's communist propaganda. He said it was Serbian propaganda.
So the war lasted for 78 days, I think you said, Rapal.
Yeah.
I wonder if we can talk a little bit more about how it was waged. For example, the media campaign of disinformation, the weapons which were used, the amount of ordnance that was dropped. You talked a little bit about that already, and the way that infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, was targeted. This was something that was quite shocking to people who were watching. Of course, most of Europe wasn't watching, and they were fed a pack of lies and they didn't watch. But for those who were watching, it was very shocking to see how civilian infrastructure was really destroyed in Yugoslavia during that war. Krapal.
Well, the war was waged on pretext. Every single one of them proved to be just the opposite of what NATO's pretexts were. For example, it was a war waged in the interest of humanitarianism, because there was going to be a humanitarian catastrophe. In fact, what the Yugoslav war did was it created a humanitarian catastrophe when there was none before. It was said that it was to restore the peace and stability in the area. In fact, what it actually did was destroyed the peace and stability in the area and created the grounds for continuing wars in that part of the world. It was said that the war was waged for averting an humanitarian catastrophe. In fact, what the war did was it produced a catastrophe. It killed a lot of people, mainly civilians, because NATO was unable to degrade the Yugoslav military. It was said that the war was waged to prevent ethnic cleansing. In fact, what the war did was it actually created the conditions for ethnic cleansing, as indeed had been earlier done in the case of Croatia and Bosnia. As a matter of fact, as I've said before, it was a war for domination and to establish an oil monopoly stretching from the Middle East to the shores of the Black and the Caspian Seas. It was also said that the war was waged to actually safeguard the rights of the Kosovan people. In fact, it didn't safeguard the rights of Kosovan people. A lot of Kosovan people were made homeless, and a lot of them were killed. They were bombed as they were fleeing their own area of abode. It was also said that the war was waged to carry out the will of the international community. But we've now come to realize what international community means. It means half a dozen imperialist gangsters, mainly really combined in what is known as the G7, which is increasingly becoming far less important. It was said war had to be waged. There was no alternative to that war. There was every single alternative to actually sort out the problems of that area. Imperialism actually has a long history of genocides and overthrow of democratic governments. And it's interesting that literally 2 weeks before the start of this war, 3 new countries were admitted into NATO: Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. This was quite contrary to the promises given by the President of the United States at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that NATO would not move an inch in the direction of Eastern Europe. In fact, since then, they have got into NATO almost all the countries of the former Eastern Socialist Bloc, and quite a few of them that were part of the Soviet Union. It was a total war, and so many international laws were broken by this war. You might as well say that you're going to burn the books on international law. And these were laws that were made up as NATO's war progressed. And in this, of course, they had the support of the imperialist media, of the imperialist political establishment, of the imperialist so-called left. The left in the imperialist countries proved to be what we have said for several decades: the left wing of imperialism, the Labour Party in Britain, the Democratic Party in the United States, the Greens in every one of these countries. They were all cheerleaders for this war. And this war rendered 2 million people in Yugoslavia jobless. It killed 1,500 civilians, 476 soldiers, and 114 police officers, and it wounded another 6,000. And there were various charlatans like the late Robin Cook, who at that time was the Foreign Secretary of Britain. And he said, well, we cannot allow these countries, and they were calling Serbia a country, to commit aggression against their own people and then hide behind the excuse of national sovereignty so that nobody can interfere. we will not allow them to do that. So you can commit internal aggression. It would be like saying that the northern states in America during the Civil War were committing aggression against the southern owning states. And our foreigners have the right to come and interfere to prevent genocide being committed. In fact, Britain wanted to interfere in the interest of slavocracy. And thanks to the opposition put forward by the working class at the time, especially the Lancashire cotton spinners, who, notwithstanding the fact that they were dying of starvation because American cotton supply had ceased to exist, they prevented Palmerston from waging war against America on behalf of the slave state. So new excuses were formed for conducting this war, that Serbia was guilty of internal aggression, so that you can interfere in the internal affairs of any country on the grounds that one part of the population was committing aggression against another on the basis of that. No civil war is immune from foreign intervention. That's what was happening in Yugoslavia. And in this, the media, with a few honorable exceptions, played its dirty role. They were basically cheerleading. The news everywhere was how human rights were going to be restored, how ethnic cleansing was to be stopped, how humanitarian catastrophe was going to be averted. And the average idiot who does not know very much, of course, fell for it. But you see, there was a time when imperialist statesmen, as well as soldiers, were able to speak the truth. I mean, Caleb would be very well acquainted with this quotation that I want to give you. I'm sorry, my voice is not very good, so you have to forgive me. This is General Smedley Butler, who in 1925 uttered these memorable words. Caleb, in 1914, I helped to make Mexico a safer place for the US oil companies. I helped to turn Haiti and Cuba into patrimony of the National City Bank in order to make a profit. In 1900 and 1912, I helped to prepare the ground in Nicaragua for international bankers Brar brothers. In 1916, I made way in the Dominican Republic for US interests. In 1903, I did all I could to make US fruit companies at home in Honduras. Now that's an American general. Generals don't speak like that anymore. They speak in the gobbledygook of averting humanitarian crisis and all the rest of it. So we don't have such candor as we had from generals those days, and some politicians as well. What we have now is euphemisms. And the more brutal there was, the more euphemistic and unctuous their language becomes.
Totally. And of course, that is entirely a consequence of the October Revolution, isn't it? Imperialists have been on the back foot ever since. They can't say what they mean. They can't announce what they're doing. They can't say that they're superior to everybody in the way that they used to just openly say. Now they have to pretend to care about humanity while they're continuing the same old behaviors. Caleb.
Sure. You think about the Yugoslav conflict, it was really like a prototype. And we saw a lot of things that developed in other imperialist, interventions since then. I mean, responsibility to protect, the idea they're going to stop a genocide, right? Humanitarian intervention. They just got to, that was used. That was, mass media was a big part of that. I talked about Samantha Power and just, making it almost seem like an activist cause, right? Oh, we want to go in and rescue those people and all of that. And you think about what they did with Sudan, later, all the interventions in Africa, the International Criminal Court. Before there was the International Criminal Court, there was the International Tribunal of Yugoslavia that eventually gave birth to the International Criminal Court. And it's been noted that every single person ever convicted by the ICC has been African. You know, I mean, the International Tribunal on Yugoslavia were Yugoslavian folks, but then after that, every person that the ICC has ever convicted has been of African descent. You also have the use of Wahhabi Muslim extremists as proxy fighters, right? And that was a big, you know, the Kosovo Liberation Army was funded by Saudi Arabia, and they were Wahhabi fanatics. They believed in the Saudi interpretation of Islam. They were trying to set up an Islamic state. It was very much Muslims versus Christians. And we saw that later in Syria. We saw that in Libya against Gaddafi. And so there was, you know, I mean, a lot of what was to come. What I think is also interesting is that that this, you know, this Yugoslav conflict, this was very much the more quote unquote liberal imperialists learning their art. You know, George W. Bush invaded Iraq. It was just the U.S. military went in there, but this is, you know, this was more the German imperialists, the British imperialists, the French, and they had a much more manipulative human rights propaganda narrative using Muslim proxy fighters. They have a much more kind of sophisticated maneuver because they've had to deal with more solid left opposition, I think. And so that's why their imperialist propaganda is a little more nuanced, you could say, but it was still very clearly a regime change operation. And the idea that, yes, any conflict anywhere, the USA has the right to go in and intervene on one side, right? And that you know, that was what was used in Libya, right? They said Gaddafi was going to go into Benghazi and kill everyone. Well, he wasn't going to do that, you know? And he said house to house. He meant he was going to hunt down the terrorists and extremists. He wasn't going to kill every person, but that was the narrative they put out there. And Barack Obama said, we stopped a genocide by bombing Libya. Well, they didn't. There was no genocide that was going to happen. Now there's modern day slave markets in Libya. So you look at the Yugoslav conflict, it was very much a prototype. What I think is also interesting is George Soros, right? He is this Hungarian billionaire who funded a lot of the counter revolutions and all of that. And, you know, he's also the main, you know, promoter and backer of the International Criminal Court. And it was, you know, that kind of activist, like lefty sounding, you know, support for regime change. That was very much, you know, what George Soros is about. And we talk now in the United States, there's a lot of right-wing folks who talk about George Soros and his influence. They claim he's a communist or something like that. But, you know, that was kind of the beginning of it. And that it was the beginning of the pro-imperialist regime change entities starting to slip themselves into leftist circles. Because I know Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, they were not so good on the Yugoslav issue. And that there was starting to emerge kind of an activist milieu in the late 90s, of people that wanted to free Mumia Abu-Jamal, that were opposed to the IMF and the World Bank, but also had very bad politics on Yugoslavia, very anti-Chinese perspective, might even have some sympathy for Cuba or Latin American socialism, but are completely in favor of and part of the human rights NGO liberal apparatus. So I think that, yeah, that was the late 90s. It was kind of a turning point.
It's definitely a moment, isn't it, where we see the imperialists. Sorry, just finish your part quickly. Where we see the imperialists ripping up the actual international law that they had pretended to care about up until that time, because the Soviet Union was there as a counterbalance. International law that was signed up to by almost all of the nations on the planet, and replaced it with what they now still talk about, the rules-based order, right? Which just means we make it up as we go along, and might is right. And we will craft narratives to present our aggression in various ways. And as you say, you know, we'll build up proxy forces, we'll intervene in the internal affairs of every country, but we'll do it in such a way where we say we're following some kind of international rules, but it turns out it's not international law. We've thrown that away. We've torn it up and thrown it away. We've now made a new set of rules, which are whatever we say they are, and they change according to our convenience. Harpal, I wondered if we could come on to looking a bit, as Caleb was just doing, at the domestic politics in Britain and the USA, like who supported the war and who opposed it, and what we learned about the left and imperialism during this process, because it was quite telling, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. But before I come to it, I just want to make a couple of points. Even in our day, although it's very uncommon, there are occasional journalists and politicians who are able to utter the truth for which they are condemned by everybody. Like Trump blurted out that the US was in Syria for its oil. There was no other reason. And everybody condemned him in the establishment, saying, we got nothing to do with oil. We're just there to prevent Assad from committing genocide against the people of Syria. And then you have a paid up Zionist who's worked for years in the New York Times, Thomas Friedman. And I'd like to give you a quotation from him. And that is, for globalization to work, America cannot be afraid to act like the almighty superpower that it is. The hidden hand of the market will never work without a hidden fist. McDonnell cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas, the designer of F-15, and the hidden fist that keeps the world safe for Silicon Valley's technology is called the United States Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. Now,
that's an
you
admission,
could not
isn't it?
disagree with a single word of that. But people are gullible. As Lenin said very long while ago, people always were and always will be foolish victims of deceit and self-deceit in politics until they learn to discover the interests of some class or other behind the moral, religious, political, and social phrases, declarations, and promises. That's what our party is constantly doing, to actually explain to our members and to whoever will listen to us what really are the class interests behind every single activity of the bourgeoisie, both in its internal and in its external policy. George Soros is not behind the International Criminal Court. He's only behind it as long as it finds the right people to prosecute. If they issue a warrant against President Putin or the obtain number of Africans, George Soros is behind it. I haven't seen George Soros come round to support it when the International Criminal Court is investigating Zionist politicians of Israel for war crimes that they're committing. And America has even threatened the International Criminal Court and its personnel that they will not be safe if they carry on with this investigation. Now, as far as the question of the local internal politics, confining ourselves to Britain, the war did one wonderful thing. It exposed, as not for a long time since the First World War, the real essence of social democracy and the so-called Greens. They all lined up for this war, and with not even one or two exceptions, the members of parliament stayed silent. When Yugoslav war was being discussed, you would have thought it was the burning issue, and the House of Commons would be streaming with people. There were 32 people sitting in the debating chamber listening to these discussions. Most of the Labour MPs made themselves unavailable because, being the cowards that they are, being the selfish people who want to protect their own little perches, they were not prepared to speak out. Like they're not prepared to speak out either over Ukraine now and to a large extent Gaza. There are a few, because there have been such pressure from the masses of people, hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating regularly in the streets of London against the genocide taking place in Gaza, that some Labour MPs, and how far does their daring go? Just calling for a permanent ceasefire. It's not that Israel is committing genocide. Anybody who even asks for a permanent ceasefire is not allowed to stand on the Labour nomination in the parliamentary elections. Most of them been got rid of. One person, Diane Abbott, was prevented from standing. And there was such a hue and cry. She's been allowed to stand, and she said she's going to stand and win. if I was her, if she had any principle, a little principle in her body, she would have said, buzz off. I'm not going to be your candidate. You're genociders. I'll stand as an independent, just like George Galloway is doing. But there are very few of them with the courage to do that. And basically, and Andrew Murray wrote a wonderful article those days, exposing the left, and particularly Ken Livingstone, calling them stock market socialists and a flight load of Luftwaffe socialists, writing in the columns of the Luftwaffe liberals, and you know, calling themselves even socialists, and that is what these people were, and it was a very, very apt description.
So I think we should talk a little bit as well about the legacy of the war, because there were certain things that were left behind in the wake of the destruction of Yugoslavia that were very important, but are still very little talked about, even 25 years later. The first, of course, is the massive pollution of Serbia by uranium-tipped weapons that were used by the NATO armies. And that's led to huge problems in the soil, in the water, a massive spike in cancer cases. And that's ongoing today, just totally ignored, basically wiped out by Western media. They don't talk about it. The second one is the separation of the Serbian province of Kosovo and its continued existence as a US base in Eastern Europe, which is basically run by a band of narco-terrorists in the service of imperialism. And the third is what Caleb referred to earlier, which is the International Criminal Court. As he said, that had its roots. You know, many young people today don't realize, they hear the word International Criminal Court and they assume it's some kind of, it's something like to do with the UN, right? Something that all the world has signed up to, that's been there a long time, that has kind of respect of the peoples of the world. It's not the case at all. It was a kangaroo court set up specifically, the tribunal, to try President Milosevic after they had destroyed Yugoslavia. They arrested, they kidnapped him from Serbia, they got him out. They tried him, and he was doing such a good, he defended himself, he didn't have lawyers, and he was doing such a good job of exposing the prosecutors that they closed down the public aspect of the hearings. They had been public and they made it private. And then they through a series of kind of medical neglect at the least, if he wasn't deliberately offed, then they just let him die. But most likely a combination of medical neglect and then just finishing him off. It was all getting very embarrassing. So they got rid of President Milosevic through the mechanism of this kangaroo court and the jail that he was held in. And then they turned that kangaroo court into the International Criminal Court through something called the Rome Statute that countries were kind of pushed into signing up to. The USA itself never signed up to it. It doesn't want to be held accountable for anything. It just finds it a useful mechanism for prosecuting, as Caleb said, up until now, African leaders that have, got up its nose for some reason or another. Only Africans so far have been tried and found guilty in the ICC. So it's not a respectable international body. It is literally an imperialist mechanism that was set up after their, triumph over Yugoslavia, if you like. So I wondered if you guys wanted to talk about either of those things. So it was the use of nuclear technologies.
I'd like to say this.
Separation of Kosovo and the ICC.
I'd like to say that as far as the ICC is concerned, you rightly said, it's a tribunal to serve the purposes of imperialism. But there have been occasions when it doesn't do so, when its chief prosecutor has got into trouble for pursuing the right course, like the previous chief prosecutor, a woman from Gambia, I think, called Bensouda. When she tried to pursue against the Israelis, she was leaned on very heavily. She was visited by Mossad agents and told she had to look after her family and herself, otherwise there could be serious consequences. And the present chief prosecutor is a total servant of imperialism. And he was getting such bad publicity that it had become a tribunal for prosecuting Africans. So in order to maintain some credibility for his tribunal, he started these investigations. First of all, issued a warrant against Putin. That was very welcome. Then he started investigating into Israeli war crimes. And that's where the US and the other imperialist establishments came down like a ton of bricks on him. So having served imperialism for years, he suddenly become the target of that. And as a result, Karim Khan has acquired some credibility, which in my view, he does not deserve. But that's a different point. The basic thing is, this is a kangaroo court. It's got nothing to do, nothing whatever to do with international law.
Definitely.
I'd like to talk about, well, first of all, I mean, I will say Milosevic, he did have one lawyer, which is a man I used to work for, Ramsey Clark. He represented him. And we used to sell Slobodan Milosevic's speech to the court, his opening defense speech, which is very eloquent and just lays out the facts about the Kosovo Liberation Army and where they came from and what was really going on. And we used to sell that pamphlet, of his speech and distribute it. The other thing about the International Criminal Court is that points to an inter-imperialist rivalry, because the ICC, George Soros was a big funder of creating it and promoting it. And the Bush faction and the Republicans in the United States absolutely hate it because they see it as an attempt to possibly regulate and control their behavior. And we have the Hague Act that was passed when the ICC was created, that if the ICC ever indicts any American citizen or any U.S. military leader, the USA has the right to bomb the Hague and invade the Hague, right? And that, sanctions were put on the International Criminal Court by Donald Trump because they were investigating U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan and various prosecutors. And now there's outrage at the International Criminal Court from Republicans in particular because they're investigating Israel. And so I view this as an inter-imperialist rivalry, and that there's one faction that thinks that they have to maintain some credibility with the Muslim world. They can't look like, they have to look like they're critical of Israel while they all support it, and et cetera. And there's one faction that doesn't, want any criticism whatsoever, and that there is a faction of the U.S. Imperialists that don't care about what Europe thinks. And there's another faction that's very concerned about maintaining the NATO alliance, right? And these are divisions within the U.S. ruling class. People talk about the big oil monopolies in Silicon Valley versus the military-industrial complex. And there are divisions within our ruling class. And one thing that Ramsey Clark pointed out is that the ICC, if there had been any talk of an ICC being created when the United Nations was formed after the Second World War, the UN would have never happened. Every country would have said no. And I mean, the ICC is completely illegal. And when you talk about the legacy of Yugoslavia, two memories that were very formative for me in my political development, come to mind. The first of which is I took peace studies. I remember my mother signed me up to take peace studies at a Quaker college. And the course was all about how we don't have to invade countries. We can have peaceful movements for social justice to bring down dictators. And they pointed toward Otpor, which was this movement funded by the U.S. government. Their symbol was a fist, looks very left. And it was funded to bring down the government of Milosevic in Yugoslavia, in Serbia. And they talked about that, and it looked like a very left-wing, anti-war kind of course that I took as a high school student, but it was actually trying to get you involved in regime change activism with this kind of liberal humanitarian face. The other thing that comes to mind is that I remember during the biggest anti-war protest that they had against the invasion of Iraq, as Bush was getting ready to leave office, there was just a huge mobilization in New York City. I mean, it was like 500,000 people were in the streets against the invasion of Iraq. And MoveOn.org, which is George Soros's NGO, was in the streets, and they had thousands of paid staffers with signs that they were handing out to everyone they could. And those signs said, "Out of Iraq into Darfur." And they were handing them out like water to all the protesters. And these protesters didn't know any better, and they were taking them. And the same weekend, they had George Clooney and others do their whole thing, have a rally in California for U.S. military intervention in Sudan. And they were very much trying to channel the anti-Iraq war sentiments into a pro-interventionist message. And that was again comes out of that Yugoslavia, thing. I mean, that Soros and his wing of the imperialists are very, very manipulative. And so I just wanted to comment on that. I mean, I've observed that directly as we talk about building an anti-imperialist movement in the West. It's very important to note these kind of manipulations and divisions, and Yugoslavia was very much a turning point where they framed it. I think there was a lot of books. I remember when I was in college, I took women's studies. We had to, we took a feminism course, and we read a book that was published against Yugoslavia. Right? And they talk about rape as a weapon of war, and there's this whole feminist discourse that comes out of the Yugoslav conflict, where it's all about, it was about liberating women, and the Serbs were using sexual violence, and there's this whole like wing of the feminist kind of movement that has used narratives about Yugoslavia to justify itself. So it's very interesting to see how a lot of what we think of now as woke and the pro-imperialist left, if you want to call it that, is very much rooted in this conflict.
I think for me, something that I've seen is how the same techniques and the same overwhelming hysterical propaganda accompanies each fresh launch of a new imperialist war. And it is totally overwhelming. And what I really notice is the difference between Yugoslavia and some of the wars which have come later is the overwhelming propaganda works as long as the war is short. Then the people kind of go along with it, and they never have a reason to go back and question how their rulers had behaved. 1999 did not lead to a big mass disenfranchisement and alienation of the people, because the war was over quickly, and it all went out according to NATO's plans, essentially. I mean, they didn't get it all their own way, as Rapal said, but for the average person who doesn't understand all of that, it seemed to go according to NATO's agenda, and they were in charge of the narrative that came afterwards, through the tribunal, through all kinds of mechanisms. They ex post facto justified their activities. And then they stopped telling us anything about what happened after that. So we didn't know. And people in general did not wake up to the ways in which they'd been manipulated and lied to. As soon as the war lasts longer, as soon as you have an ongoing occupation situation where there's a resistance, like in Afghanistan, like in Iraq, you begin to have massive problems for the imperialists, because their narrative starts to fall apart. They themselves start fighting with one another because they're not successful. In that process, space opens up. They start hurling accusations. You start getting leaks. And the process is very educative for ordinary people, because truths start to come through about the ways in which they've been manipulated and lied to. And those manipulations and lies and the sense of betrayal and distrust that build up, and cynicism that build up in the working class is very significant from those wars where the imperialists get exposed because the resistance is so strong, and the lie, the fabric of their propaganda narrative starts to come unstuck. And that was something I noticed, that initial onslaught then did not get rebutted in a way that most people would ever have noticed. Of course, all the information is there. If you want to go and look for it, how you were lied to regarding Yugoslavia, all the information is available. It's just very little of it has ever made it in front of the eyes of, ordinary people, if you like. Gopal?
I'd like to make one general point, which is of interest in every discussion about every war, and that is, how come that the so-called left-wing sides with imperialism? That has been the case since social democracy betrayed the working class since the First World War and joined its own bourgeoisie to defend the fatherland, rather than fight against its own bourgeoisie to bring it down and have a proletarian revolution. The Bolsheviks were the exception. So as Lenin pointed out again and again, what exactly is the basis of that? Well-known socialist. Kautsky was considered the best theoretician of Marxism since the death of Engels. What happened to them that overnight there was really an epidemic of desertion to the bourgeoisie? And the answer for that was opportunism in the working class movement. And what is that opportunism? What's the economic basis of it? The economic basis of it, that ever since free competition capitalism turned into monopoly capitalism, everywhere it has established a monopoly. It seeks nothing but monopoly everywhere, in trade, in avenues of investment, in avenues of raw materials. And because it makes so much profit through its monopolies, imperialism is able to and does spend a portion of its super profits in bribing the upper layers of the working class. And they are bribed, no question about it. Trade union officials, members of parliament, leaders of local councils, local councillors, and people working in media, in the BBC, in ITV, and all sorts of other media. All these are bribed people. Actually, if you said to them they're bribed, they'd be horrified. They don't even think of that. They are bribed. They're doing very nicely, thank you. And the position of the other party, the downtrodden people at home and abroad, don't get a look at. I have had some very heated discussions, lasting sometimes all night, with comrades attending international communist seminars in Belgium. And they would fiercely fight against me when I brought this question of the effect of imperialism on the working class movement. It wasn't an original of mine. It was Lenin's thesis I was putting forward. I was putting it forward because I was convinced of its truthfulness and of its importance. And the working class movement has to be taught that. A lot of communists are not able to do that because a lot of communist members are some from privileged backgrounds. They don't want to upset them. We're not in the business of pleasing everybody. We need to say the correct thing, even if it upsets people. Is it believable that hardly there's a trade union leader in Britain who supports the Ukrainian people struggle against NATO, but thousands of them have been mobilized by the other side to fight against Russia for poor little Ukraine, because these idiots don't understand. Poor little Ukraine is a pawn, is merely an instrument for fighting against Russia. It's not Ukraine's war against Russia and Russia's war against Ukraine. It's NATO's war against Russia. And Russia, in fighting that war, is fighting not only just to defend its own territorial integrity, its own sovereignty, it's fighting for the whole of humanity. The defeat of NATO in Ukraine is going to be the most significant achievement of humanity in the last 30, 40 years. That's why it's horrible to say it's even more important than what's happening in the Middle East. Important though it is what's happening in the Middle East. What is happening in Ukraine is by far the most important battle being waged. And every class-conscious worker, every socialist has a duty to defend Russia instead of going along with some idiots either saying Russia is imperialist, but NATO countries are democratic. Or if they are really going to be even-handed, they say it's an inter-imperialist war. On both sides is imperialism fighting. We have to say Russia is not an imperialist country. Russia is not fighting an imperialist war. Russia is fighting to defend itself against NATO, which is determined to break up Russia into small, digestible parts. And in doing so, Russia is upholding international law. It's upholding the rights of a lot of people who are targets of NATO's imperialism. NATO is no longer what it claimed to be, a defensive alliance. It's an alliance which wants to dominate the world under US leadership. It's an alliance which actually no longer confines itself to its original territory of Euro-Atlantic area. In fact, with the Yugoslav war, their slogan was NATO outside of area or NATO outside of business. It'll have no business. So NATO must act everywhere. So NATO fought for the Iraq war. What business NATO did have to do with Iraq? But it did, because that's what it has been turned into. So the defeat of NATO is very important. Everywhere our slogan should be defeat of NATO and disband NATO. Let every people in every country demand that their country gets out of NATO. In Britain, no Labour Party member is able to say that because they're thrown out of the Labour Party straight away. But they're so corrupted, they so want to be in the Labour Party, they keep their mouths shut.
100%. I think that's a really good place to leave it. I just would like to make one last point as we go, which is Yugoslavia provided us with a lesson in what imperialism is really about. This 10-year project, in fact, to destroy the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, a country which had the potential to be strong, sovereign, independent in Europe. And it wasn't allowed to be that. After the fall of the Soviet Union, it was the first target, along with Iraq, of the imperialists. And if you look at the map today, you will just look at where Kosovo is, the part of Serbia, the province of Serbia that's been broken off of Serbia and turned into basically a US base. USA has a huge base in Kosovo. It's called Camp Bondsteel, and that's where the real government of the Kosovo province lies. Its enforcers are the Kosovo narco-terrorists, but the real power in that Kosovo province is in that NATO Camp Bondsteel, it's called. Look at the map and see the major routes which go through and just next to Camp Bondsteel, and you understand much more about what the Yugoslav war was all about than any of the reams of press coverage you got in the West, either at the time or since.
And I'll just say one last thing, which is look at Serbia today, look at former Yugoslavia today. Are the people any better off? And the same for Libya, the same for Afghanistan, the same for Syria. Every time they make the case, oh, we have to go in and rescue the people of that country always end up worse off. Every single time. So don't get fooled again. Right. And that's what we need to urge people. You know, they say they care so much about these people. They always end up worse off. Not a single place have they ever made life better. So there you go.
Can I make a last point as well?
Go ahead.
Kosovo declared its independence in 2008. It's a hollow independence. This independence is guaranteed by 35,000 NATO troops, about 3,000 European Union policemen, and a European Union representative who has the right to veto any legislation passed by the Kosovan so-called parliament. And the KLA run this place. This KLA have greater expertise in running drug rings, prostitution rackets than in statecraft. And they are basically the criminal thugs in the employment of imperialism. That's what they are. Even the European Union countries, not every country, recognizes its independence. And of course, if the Kosovans say they cannot live with the Serbs say they can't live with the Kosovars. So they'd want a part of the area in Kosovo which would become part of Yugoslavia. So instead of bringing stability, NATO's war had destabilized the whole region. And from that destabilization, it continues to suffer even today.